And welcome into today's roundtable. Bill Priestley here with you, and we're looking at what's happening going on overseas in terms of what's coming this way and how it may have changed over the course of the past several days or so after Henry Byers' article came out. Joining us to talk about it is Henry Byers. Joining us is our ocean intelligence expert, and also Dr. Sal Mercogliano from Campbell University, Associate Professor of History there as well, and host of What's Going On with Shipping on YouTube there as well. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us here for this roundtable. Henry, we had you on last week to talk about this article that you had written about how things are changing. You got more rejections that are coming in terms of carriers trying to inflate spot rates to try and basically stay financially stable in that area. You also have a number of ships that are not making, or the bookings are actually dropping over the course of that time as well. How has that changed from last week to this week? Because it looked like at that particular point things were headed in a pretty desperate direction.
No, that's a great question, Bill. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. So when you're looking at the demand, we have two ways of looking at it. One is the date that those volumes are booked. So we would expect to see peak season occur earlier because essentially as that cargo is becoming ready at the factories, it's being booked. So it's further upstream. That it also is not subject to how well or how much velocity or the utilization rates essentially. Of how well those volumes are being facilitated by available capacity. So we see the peak before peak actually occurs in that bookings data. And what we're seeing right now is a real nasty deceleration from the high on August 1st. And it's the rate of the deceleration, but also you can see there, basically we're getting back to a level where it's not just kind of a reversion back to where we were in the lead into peak season, kind of in June and July. It's more of a March and potentially February level, which was Chinese New Year, and that's when those are levels that are pretty low. Those would be levels that were decently below 2019 during that period, and it's one of those where we could be looking at, and again, I had forecast a 10 to 20% decline underneath 2019 second half for 2023 second half. And I think that's very likely to happen.
Sal, you got a chance to look at that first chart. Let me throw up a second one here. The Ocean TEU Rejection Index, obviously in terms of things that are going in the opposite direction, more TEUs being rejected now with less bookings coming across. We talked about a little bit about this last week and the fact that this could be setting us up for a rather large bubble here, at least in the immediate short term. What do you see here?
Well, I think if you look at both what Henry did and then Greg Miller's latest piece, we're looking at Descartes, for example, their U.S. container import volumes. We know in October there's always the drop. There's always that drop off in the number of containers coming in. I think what Henry is forecasting very accurately is that we're going to see this drop probably happen earlier, maybe is in September. And the question is going to be really that level of drop off we're going to see. Right now, we're still kind of coming up. We look a lot like 2019, 2022 years right now, but that level is going to all of a sudden come off, and I think it has a lot to do with obviously the mix we're seeing in the economy with inflation. It's been all over the place, clearing out those warehouses, getting those distribution centers to clear out back items, and we're seeing that kind of influx in right now. But I agree with Henry. I think we're going to see this drop off, and it may be much more severe than we've seen in recent years.
Going back to that TEU rejection index chart, Henry, as you see it, obviously you mentioned this last week, and we hadn't seen the plateau portion of the end of that chart. We had seen the increase, but not so much the plateau. What does that indicate as far as you're seeing?
Well, I mean, it's kind of, I feel like this is, really par for the course at this point, as far as like data sets kind of reversing trend in a very anomalous way. What this says to me is we had expected those rejection rates to start coming back down because, again, importers are well aware of the timeline, essentially how soon they need to get those goods for the retail holiday season into the country to be able to meet demand sufficiently. So when September comes around, yes, there's still sometimes peak volumes, but it tapers off within the first couple of weeks, and then in the lead into Golden Week is really kind of the end of peak season officially. We're seeing that the end of peak season occur a little sooner, but the rejection rate is so incredibly interesting at this point because carriers really showed their cards back on April 15th when they caused rejection rates to increase, there was no demand surge to warrant any type of increase at that point. There was neither a decrease in capacity through the use of blank sailings. And so what that said is basically they were getting, importers to kind of feel tightness a little bit, to go ahead and, say, hey, you never know where rates might go. Spot rates may go, super high. And on the hills of the last couple of years, where some shippers, being exposed to the spot market, got absolutely hammered, that is still very fresh in their memory as well. So if that were to happen, they're thinking about how can they hedge against that risk. And it did get them to sign contracts a little bit earlier. I mean, it's kind of widely noted. But they're risky, manipulating the market a little bit in order for that to happen, because it caused that little bit of that artificial tightness. So right now, them rejecting that much cargo like they were during the height of the pandemic in 2020, when the world was essentially locked down for a few weeks, to me says that this is really a desperate attempt to keep as much pressure on spot rates as possible, because they're not even concerned about the short-term consequences this is going to have with their shipper clients, who are going to come for those rate reductions, extra hard once this deceleration really plays out in terms of departing volumes.
Sal, how much are these carriers basically playing their cards in terms of what they're trying to do here in artificially kind of keeping spot rates up by rejecting so much cargo?
I think you got a couple of factors playing on the ocean side. We have a huge spike in fuel costs right now, and so fuel costs are going up through the roof. We're also seeing Alphaliner just came out with a study showing that the size of vessels on the routes are increasing. These are those new tonnage that's coming out. I think the ocean carriers are really trying to maximize the tonnage on board their vessels going on key routes. You have the Panama Canal going on, which is forcing a shift in some cargo going out of Asia. Instead of going eastward, it's going westward. And so I think that may be accounting for some of the factor we're seeing in these rejections too, is that cargo is shifting. Cargo is shifting onto bigger ships, more fuel efficient vessels, so that the cargo carriers can maximize their profits, while at the same time dealing with issues like the Panama Canal, which is still at low levels. We're hoping to see some rains raise those levels up, but that's impacting that shift over to the East Coast of the United States. So I think there's a myriad of factors at play here, and looking at the data helps us kind of get a good idea on it. But the ocean side is dealing with these new technologies, these new vessels.
Henry, you sent over one other chart here. This is the Ocean TEU's entire chart as it comes up here in just a second. There you have it in terms of how things kind of amalgamate in the full process here. Looking forward in terms of how things play out over the course of the next 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, and so forth. Obviously, we expect the rejection rates to come down. We expect bookings, I guess, still to remain somewhat low, again, as that continues to drop off. But what's your initial forecast as you look at this chart in terms of what's going to happen over the course of the next, say, 3 months to 6 months?
Well, there's no doubt, and I added, some additional days forward, so you can kind of see demand. You kind of see that steep drop off at the end of there. That's what's like expected to move in the next 5 days. So like when you're looking at the pressure as far as like what volumes, like what demand is wanting to do in terms of pressure on rates, it's wanting to drop. But what's happening is that, with the rejections, again, it speaks to the success carriers have had in reducing the supply side. And I think Sal certainly adds a lot more of a balanced approach, and I think a good perspective, because I'm living in this data and kind of in the trenches with shippers day in and day out. So, it just speaks to the success that they've had in, making that a higher for longer, which is certainly the key phrases you hear right now with the Fed and everything. But until those rejections come down, we're not going to see it, quite play out in terms of trend like the booking index. But that is the volume. It's the same volume. So what's being booked, again, if you look at the water hose analogy, it is literally the water feeding into the hose. So if that starts to drop off, that will inevitably play out in what water goes out of the garden hose. So I think that's certainly going to happen here in the next couple weeks. And I think from that point forward, again, shippers becoming in tune to where spot rates should be. I think the downwards pressure will be extreme. And I do think a new low for spot rates on the Trans-Pacific, specifically West Coast. Again, Sal mentioned Panama Canal, East Coast rates may have a bit more higher pressure, but it's demand at the end of the day. And I think you could see a new low in both of those rates come the end of 2023.
Sal, we got about a minute left here. Do you think this is going to be a bubble that's going to burst wildly here on carriers?
Well, I mean, we always see the end of the season where this drop happens. And remember, we just saw those reports come in about the ocean carriers fretting about only making $8 billion in Q2. They're obviously worried about keeping their profitability up going forward. So they're going to do everything they can to maximize this, from blank sailings to consolidating loads as much as you can. But as Henry aptly talks about, it is demand. It's how much is being pulled on that system. And one of the things we're seeing that shift again back onto that West Coast, a lot of draw to get cargo onto the West Coast, but the East Coast is where a lot of shippers want that cargo going right now, and they got flexibility. There's a lot more options and capacity out there. Shippers can add capacity as needed. They're just trying to kind of pull back right now and really deal with the low drop they're seeing. The question is, how big of a drop?
It's going to be very interesting to watch over the course of the next several days and weeks how this all plans out. Sal Mercado-Gallo and Henry Byers, thanks so much for joining us for this roundtable. All right, we'll move it over to Kaylee next for our last check of headlines.